Thank you all for coming here this afternoon. So I'm going to begin this presentation by outlining some results from a recent Liebe Group survey, and then Rob is going to discuss how adoption trends fit with on-farm profit. So, for those of you who don't know, the Liebe Group is a farmer group that conducts on-farm research in the shires of Dalwallinu, Karoo, Perenjori and Wongan-Ballaju. And since 2006, we've been conducting a survey of our members to see how they change in terms of adopting new technologies. So every 3 years, the same group of farmers have been surveyed. Of those farmers, 50 were members of our group and 11 were non-members. So the aim of this survey was to measure adoption trends over time, but also evaluate the effectiveness of the Liebe Group projects, particularly those funded by GRDC. So, who were these people that we surveyed? Well, they farmed an average of 6,000 hectares in 2012, and this farm size has increased by 1,500 hectares since 2006, mainly due to larger farmers buying out the smaller neighbours. On average, 78% of the farm is cropped, and the average time spent farming is 23 years. They're also a very optimistic bunch. In the survey, we asked growers how they felt about the long-term future of farming in their area. They had to rate this on a scale of 1 to 7, and overwhelmingly they indicated 6, which indicates optimism. So to do this survey, we used the theories of David Pannell, and that outlined that all farmers go through a series of steps when they adopt a new technology. So first of all, they had to be aware of it. So we asked the farmers whether they were aware of, say, yield mapping. If they answered yes, then they had to choose one of those boxes. So they were either had no intention of using it, perhaps they were researching it, perhaps they were testing it. They just had to choose one. So we surveyed a huge range of practices, from everything from liming to plant tissue testing to deep ripping. Today I'm going to focus on a small section of technologies, and I'd like to begin with soil testing. So this graph points out the number of growers using the technology in 2006, the blue, and 2012, which is the maroon. So as you can see, the use of soil testing is highly adopted technology. And I'd just like to go into that in a bit more detail. So 98% of our farmers are testing their topsoil, and 67% are doing their subsoils. And anecdotally, from what I can gather, this is quite high compared to the rest of the state. And it probably reflects the really historic interest that the Liebe Group has had in soil health. It's an interest our farmers have had for many years, and we have the equipment to test our subsoils to 1.6 metres. So at every field day, all the trial sites, they can see the subsoil, and it sparks interest in their own paddocks. Also, as part of the survey, we asked growers what they considered to be the most important tool for managing yield variability on their farm. A majority of the farmers indicated soil testing. So what we have is a highly adopted practice that is considered to be very important by the farmers. So as an industry, it's important for us to make sure they have accurate tests. And the continued development of the different P tests is a good example, just continuing that process. And it's also important to know what we do with that information. So to hear Yvette Oliver's speech on how we use that information is important as well. So back to our slides. One of the big changes since 2006 has been the use of auto steer. Yield mapping has also increased, and although variable rate technology has low adoption overall, it's really grown in the last few years. With many of the growers surveyed, 2012 was the first season in which they had used variable rate technology. And one of the things that's helped them take that step has been the creation of zone maps. And to do this, they are using a professional that they met at a Liebe Group event. So for us, that highlights the importance that grower groups place on linking growers and the people who can help them adopt technology. And biomass imagery, small proportion used, and it hasn't really changed over time. So I'd just like to go into two very different adoption stories. We have liming and tramline farming, also known as controlled traffic. Both of these technologies address a subsoil constraint. Liming, its acidity; tramline farming, its compaction. And both of these are prevalent within the Liebe area, and they are impacting our yield. But liming, hugely popular. Tramlining, not so popular. So from what some of the farmers are saying, tramlining is good in theory, but it's hard to put into practice. It's really hard to match the machinery, and people are very focused on keeping their seeding efficiencies that they're reluctant to perhaps use smaller machinery or tie themselves in to a smaller system. And it's a little bit hard to see the profit in it. So if we look at the adoption story for tramlining in a bit more detail, we've got, this graph shows where farmers are over time. So 2006 is in the darker colour, 2012 is in the lighter, and the farmers had to choose one of those categories. So you can see that in 2006 there was about 35% of growers researching tramline farming, and then this dropped off in 2012. There's much less number of growers. Interestingly, in 2006, Liebe Group had a project with GRDC and DAFWA which looked at tramlining. So there was a lot of trials and discussion going around the shires about this process. So come 2012, these farmers have made some sort of decision, and the decision is they've decided not to adopt the technology. So you can see there's more growers in the not adopting categories than there were in the adopting. So the farmers have looked at the information, they've come up with their decision that it's not for them at this stage, and that's something that the Liebe Group accept. They know their farm better than we do, and time will tell what happens. So another way at looking at adoption is by this curve. It states that for every innovation, there is a few people take it up, and then it gains popularity, you copy your neighbour, before you know it, everybody's having a go. So it's up here. For the Liebe area, liming is something that is at saturation, but tramlining is down here. And really only time will tell whether tramlining will ever become as popular as liming. We'll have to see. So how does the Liebe Group compare to the rest of Australia? Well, I compared our results to a GRDC grower survey, and in terms of variable rate technology, we're pretty much on par. In terms of liming, we are well ahead of the game. Fair enough, we do have quite acidic soils, but from what I can gather, many parts of Australia do as well, so we're not alone there. But in terms of tramlining, or as they call it, controlled traffic, we're well below average compared to the rest of the country. So that concludes my intro. I'll now hand over to Rob.
Thanks, Nadine. So Nadine's given you the facts and figures, and I've got the difficult job of explaining why to some extent. But I thought what we'd start with is actually looking at the growers' responses to a couple of questions about the main benefit of the adoption and what they're really chasing. And you can see that the one that came out on top was increased profit. which as a consultant I was very pleased to see. And I think this thing here is something that researchers do need to recognise, though. We're dealing with large-scale farming, and really with that comes logistics management as a critical part of that. So it's no use doing the job very well on the first 100 hectares and then there's another 5,000 that aren't done so well. So it's really about getting 95% of the job done on that big area, making sure things run smoothly. And so ease of management, improved ease of management is a big ticket. And then it comes down to the improved seed and fertiliser management, which really just recognises these as being some of the fundamentals to getting a crop established and growing well. And finally, improved soil health. We're not saying that soil health is the big issue, but it's really saying that it doesn't matter how good your soil is, if you really can't get it in and make a profit out of it, there's not much point in doing it. So, no real surprises there. I guess the other thing, though, is then thinking about the limitations on those businesses. And what was asked there is what factor was nominated as a limitation. Now, the farm economics, we've probably cheated a bit here because there was actually a number of questions that addressed that farm economics issue. But what we've done is we've tried to group those types of questions into the areas that it applied to. And farm economics came out at 38%, where you would have thought, instinctively perhaps, given the shocking run of seasons we've had, although it hasn't been as bad in the north, so that could explain why it's not as high. But yeah, that was 26%. Then we've got the old labour and rural population decline at 17. And really, herbicide resistance, which once again is probably painted as the big ticket item for a lot of researchers, was actually only 8%. So I think it does put in perspective that any research or any technology that we're looking to adopt has really got to address the farm economics, otherwise you're really going to be not addressing the biggest limitation that your clients are seeing. What I thought I'd do here is just try and show that I think with farm economics we often push, this is percentage of rainfall here, and this is the 5-year average return on farm production assets. So this is a true measure of profitability, and we've taken out the fact whether you're low rainfall, high rainfall, by putting it on a return on production assets. And if you look at the squares are obviously the better performing people. And really, you know, to say that there was a very clear trend that was only rainfall that allowed people to perform well is obviously wrong. You can see that even people that dropped below 0%, so they made a true loss over that 5-year period, you know, we had just as many up here that were getting at rainfall or above average rainfall. So I guess the first thing to say is that spread from here to here is all about management. The spread from here to here, you know, you'd expect that should have been a straight line if it was all to do with production and rainfall. So that's the first point. The next point is, given a certain amount of rainfall, you can generate a certain amount of wheat, and that varies significantly as well. It's obviously very much harder when you get down to low rainfalls to have a big difference between the top and the bottom. As soon as you get over a certain amount, you can start to really see where management kicks in, and the more rainfall, the bigger the difference can be. So once again, you know, growing season rainfall, you can get somebody that's got the same growing season rainfall that's gone from 1.5 tonne up to 3 tonne. Once again, it's that management, it's putting together those resources to make the best out of it. Now, I couldn't let an opportunity go by without mentioning costs. I think often we focus on price, we focus on yield, and costs is the poor cousin. But this is to prove that costs do matter, and costs can have a huge range. This is basically operating variable costs on the left-hand side, and there's no axis here, it's really just spread out. And the spread is saying, look, we can run from anything below 50% variable costs right up to, well, nearly 100. And once again, that is a function of yield, because obviously if you make more income, you can spend more to get there. But basically people that can stay within this area matching their inputs to their yield potential, and that's a very critical issue. And I think once again, as researchers, sometimes we can ignore that at our peril. Probably the better way to show it is to show variable operating costs on a dollars per tonne basis, because what that really does is put it into perspective. And don't forget, this is only the variable cost. This isn't total cost. There's probably another $50 a tonne at least of fixed cost that could be added to this. But this describes resilience. So people that are down here at less than 150, that business is quite resilient to prices going up and down through this period here, above it. But if you're sitting up here, and we do have people that have been quite successful at running quite high cost operations, and it all works well when wheat price is high, but when the wheat price drops, they can end up making huge losses. So once again, it's to reinforce that this input costs, input levels is really critical, and it's something that needs to have continued effort. And finally, it's just showing that water use efficiency is a main driver of operating profit. There's no doubt about that. But there's also a fair bit of noise around that line, and that's management. Okay, so basically, in summary, I'd like to say that it's always difficult with extension to actually nail something, a hard-hitting message out of a survey. But what I'd like you to take away is that basically, in 2006, we're right in the middle of a drought, okay? Up north, 06-07, shocking drought up there, and then 08 was a bit of a recovery, and then right through. But the growers in the Liebe survey were able to stay very optimistic through that period, and some of that's to do with that having other people around you sharing the same experience and swapping those ideas, but I think it's actually having input into research which they believe is going to make a difference in the future. So not only is it good for your outcomes in terms of research being quite applied and actually doing things that matter, it also allows the people within that industry to think that they have some control of their destiny and that they can have an influence on the future, and therefore they're going to remain more optimistic about that future. So key messages: grower groups have a role to play in adoption. The adoption of various technologies can have a number of influences. I think that seeing the research done in your location and that you've had influence on how it's conducted, so you can be sure that I think one of the biggest negatives about some research is farmers will go along and say, well, that's not done anything like district practice. That doesn't even approach it. Therefore, I have to negate those results to some extent because I don't believe I can apply it directly to my farm. I think the other important thing is not adopting can be the right decision. If you've looked at technology and you believe it doesn't fit into your system and you can't put it into your system without putting your business at too much risk, or that it's going to affect your logistics management, then the right decision could well be that you don't adopt. Cost of production per tonne is critical, and I think that if we could have a lot of our adoption and technology being measured in that sense, then we could get some better outcomes. And finally, growers need to adopt technology that will increase profit margins, which includes costs. It's production as well as costs. We can't be just production focused, and we can never forget about risk. That's all. Thank you. Any questions?
We've got about 5 minutes for questions, if anyone has anything for Nadine or Rob.
Yes, Chris. Oh, sorry. Good job.
Thanks, guys. It's a liming one, and I agree with your results up there, and the Liebe Group is shining out in front of many of the other groups and many other areas where liming is not so highly adopted. Do you have any comments on the extent of the adoption, or are you going to, maybe in the future look at the questionnaire to actually get the rates of liming and the quantities and things that they're putting out? Because I have a feeling that although they are putting lime out, it's still well below what we think might be necessary across there.
Yeah, so we have been asking the rates in our spring field day survey, so there's probably 150 farmers there. We got them to put their tonnes applied and their hectares, so we can calculate that out, and we might try and do that every 3 years as well to keep track of that, because it would be a good measure.
Yeah, thanks, and hopefully we'll see the PHs will follow along behind, so no, it's good.
Sorry.
Just a question for Nadine. You might have mentioned it, Nadine. I might have not heard it, but how did you choose the growers in this survey?
It was done in 2006, and I wasn't here. Rob, how did you choose your farmers?
Basically, the previous researcher rang people up, and if they agreed, they were in the survey. There was mostly in the Liebe Group itself, so she actually ran through that list first, and then they added some other people just to get some geographical spread. I think there might have been a slight bias this session because some of the younger people decided that they would participate rather than the older farmers, so that could explain why the years of experience hasn't changed particularly. Had some younger people coming in.
Thanks. Just a question about perhaps the influences of the decisions to adopt or not adopt. It's probably asking more questions, which is often hard to get out of growers. But the things like why are they using a lot of lime, and who have been the big influences in that. So I guess that's part of the question is there's clearly a role for the grower group, but what role is the grower group playing in some of these decisions, and what role, are other people playing, such as Chris Gazy or, relevant researchers, etc.?
I sort of feel it's very much a joint effort. I mean, the Liebe Group wouldn't be able to do any research if it wasn't for people like Chris and Craig and those researchers. We're extension people, so I feel like it's a team effort, and this project had a committee. Rob was on the committee, some DAFLA people on the committee, and some farmers. So for us, it's all about bringing everyone together. They spend a couple of hours together, nut out the problems. Did you have any comments?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question, and it's always difficult to nail it down, but I think that's a good answer, Nadine. But just to take it a little bit further, the lime story versus the tramlining story, perhaps. I think where it's easy to pull into a system, and guys are pretty good at getting trucks sorted and lime hitting the paddocks and spread. It's all technology which is there, which is easy to apply. If they can see good benefits and it's an economic benefit, then that will get adopted fairly quickly by people with good knowledge. The tramlining one is a classic where the benefits are there, but they're quite difficult to implement, and they're quite costly. So I think tramlining will increase over time, but I think there's a certain waiting game in terms of the problem with trying to match equipment is a big issue because we keep getting bigger. So originally they were trying to match 40-foot stuff. Now they've gone to 50. Now they're going to 60. So it's a bit of a moving target, and that is difficult. And ultimately, as I was saying before, large-scale operations, we've got to cover the country. No time of sowing is a major issue. So guys aren't prepared to sacrifice width of seeding just to go tramlining. And the benefits are a little harder to measure and take time to measure. But I would add that deep ripping is something which I can't understand why I'd say the adoption has dropped off, and yet it's a well-proven technology which is reasonably easy to implement. So it's interesting that sometimes we might have to go back and revisit stuff and give it a push just to make sure that people are getting the best out of things, because the people that are deep ripping are doing better. There's no doubt about it.
One last question down the back.
I was a bit late arriving, but I thought I heard that the adoption rate of zoning farms is quite high, yet the adoption of variable rate was quite low. Do you see that as farmers progress through that process of zoning the farm up, is that going to progress to variable rate technology?
Yeah, I think the farmers in the Liebe area seem to be at the beginning of their little variable rate process. Like I said, many of the farmers, last season was their first season. A couple say, yep, I've now got the machine that'll do it, I'm going to start. So I have a feeling that will, if the paddock is variable to start with, variable rate might pick up in the next couple of years. Did that answer your question?
I think it was a comparative basis as well. So it was just saying that Liebe Group members compared to the GRDC survey were about the same in that respect, but in tramlining they're well back. That's been my experience as well, just in my consulting field, that there's a lot of guys that have been reluctant to get the equipment until recently because there was some issues with it, not working and that sort of thing. And they wanted to be confident of that mechanical reliability at that end before they really bothered to implement it. But I think they're getting some confidence now. But I would say that machinery dealers with support for that type of technology is still lacking a bit, and that does worry some farmers, that they're just thinking, if something happens, I need somebody I can ring who'll come out and fix it. Otherwise, I'm not interested. So I think, yeah, we've got the software, we've got that sort of ability. That's nailed down. They've now got the hardware, but just making sure the two things talk to each other and operate well in dusty and trying conditions is something that perhaps farmers aren't super confident of yet, but they're getting there.